join me in welcoming Dr. Jean Marie here, who's nicely coming to give you a little talk on scale. And I'm just going to read out a little bit about him so that you guys get a bit of his background. So Dr. Jean Marie was educated at the Sorbonne, Paris, with a bachelor, a master, and a PhD in art history. It was also at Sorbonne he began his teaching career. Since 2002, he's been an associate professor. Between 2008 and 2012, he was head of medieval studies at the INHA, which is the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art. Sorry, my French was obviously
No, that's fine. That's really good.
I'm so terribly sorry about that.
No, that's really good.
Where he supervised several national and international research programs. In 2009, he received a postdoc degree from the University of Coimbra for his research on the 15th century Portuguese sculpture and its relationship to European sculpture, and was granted the Gulbenkian Prize of the Portuguese Academy of History. In 2011, he spent several months at Yale University as a Fosillon Fellow. In 2013, he was elected for 5 years as a junior member of the Institut Universitaire de France, IUF. In 2016, he became the scientific secretary of the Committee International for the History of Art. His work deals with 14th century sculpture and architecture in France and in Portugal, as well as issues of artistic and cultural interchanges in Gothic Europe.
Thank you very much.
He currently works in the social and cultural history of the technical gesture in late medieval craftsmanship. He recently wrote several studies about micro-architecture of flamboyant Gothic and late medieval constructive technicality, as well as several books and papers on the artistic production of the late Middle Ages with a particular focus on sculpture and architecture. So without any further ado, I'll hand the stage over to you.
Thank you. When I heard something like that, I'm very impressed by myself. But I should not. Definitely it's not. Thank you very much for that. And I'm very grateful to the team of the University of Jindal to organizing this conference at the last minute, at the very last minute, and which allows me to meet Indian colleagues and students, and I'm really pleased of that. And I must also say that I'm very grateful to the service of the French Embassy for the help. They facilitated me my stay in India, and I would like to thank for that Bertrand Harting, Alice Bruno, and of course Léa Cézanne for their support. Thank you very much again. I hope that they will find themselves well thanked, because I must admit that I took a risk for this conference and by proposing a topic on the question of scale in medieval art and architecture, in medieval art history. Indeed, from several points of view, Western art historians seem to have been disturbed by these objects, the object of scale, or in any case, do not know what to do with this question of the scale and the proportion, as it can be or not relevant as an heuristic category, a category that allows us to question the value of the different uses of the grand or the colossal, or on the one hand, and of the small or the tiny on the other hand. This is particularly true for the work of the Western medievalists, who mainly eluded completely this question about the works of art they considered. On these artworks precisely, I would like to present some thoughts that may be of some help, that may perhaps shed light on the debates on other periods, and perhaps on Indian practices as well. Indeed, medievalists would be very reluctant to refuse to acknowledge that their view on their objects, on the objects and artwork they study, is not imbued with a kind of mystique of the size, I may say so. But it is true that it has primarily concerned the other end, the one end of the spectrum of the sign, that is of the gigantic scale, that is the scale of the colossal. And one of the most obvious traces of this mystique of the size of the scale is the ancient comparison established by medievalists with the great monuments of contemporary urban landscapes, mainly in Anglo-Saxon territories, and during the race to the height of what has been called the Roaring Twenties of the 20th century, such as the Empire State Building here. Indeed, let us remember that the rehabilitation of the Gothic forms during the 18th siècle, 18th century, with Christopher Wren or Pierre Logier, the Père Logier, for instance. First, this rehabilitation took the path of admiration for the conquest of the gigantic, the monumental, and for the technical challenges that these conquests implied. And it is true that the gigantic seems at first to occupy alone the heroic register of creation in medieval arts, that of great constructions and great achievements. And in this sense, the medieval sublime is first of all the heir of an ancient monumental syntax. More precisely, it was a syntax elaborated during the Constantinian period, during the 4th century, through the great foundations of Constantine, of the Emperor Constantine, both in Rome and Jerusalem, such as St. Peter in Rome or the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre Basilica in Jerusalem. These monumental syntax of gigantism has took its roots in the canons of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which gives great importance to the performance of gigantism and of which traces can be found concurrently in the Muslim world. Nevertheless, one could legitimately reproach medieval art historians here for integrating only a part of this medieval heritage of the ancient rhetoric into their work with regard to the heroic register of creation. Historians of medieval aesthetics, such as Marika Rüther, for instance, have stressed in particular how poetics as well as medieval Latin literature have reserved an equal place and importance alongside the amplificatio and the dilatatio, alongside the grandness and the colossal scale, to, that is to say, to the abbreviatio, that is to say, to the diminution, to the miniaturization. And this is the important point to underline here as a medievalist. I mean, this dialectical and complementary relationship that unites the sublime in the gigantic and the sublime in the macroscopic in the Middle Ages. An overview of a part of the medieval textual documentation, but also of an even more important part of the material and archaeological documentation, suggests that the mode of the large monumental scale and that of the miniature and the tiny are not antithetical, but constitute two absolutely interdependent aspects of all the, I quote, the admirable things, to quote this literature. It was indeed Paul Binsky of Cambridge who recently insisted on this interdependence of the great and the small in his book about the English decorated style, in which he stressed how much the era of Gothic heroic gigantism, which took place between the end of the 11th century until the beginning of the 14th century, that is that of Amiens, for instance, what I showed you earlier. This period had also been the period of an astonishing hyper-miniaturization of many artistic or craft productions, as it can be illustrated by the most famous seal of Richard de Berry, Durham, the Bishop of Durham. an hyper-miniaturization that generates an effect of what has been called the multum in parvo, which means a lot of things in a little space, a lot of things in a tiny little space. And this effect of multum in parvo has never been reached with such intensity for the period before 1300. Of course, many explanatory factors must be called upon here to shed light on this miniaturization of forms. As, for example, the growing role, the growing place taken by the market in the productions, because it is for this market, for the market, that transportable objects intended for private devotion, for private uses, are produced, or that they need to have, for instance, a single a tiny sheet of ivory for their devotion, or a single manipulable book of the Bible or the Psalters, like here. And Paul Binsky, going through this idea, Paul Binsky therefore recognizes behind that evolution, that miniaturization, a process, a marketing process, something like that, what he calls a recognized in these performances of nanotechnology, a consumerist genius, as I've been quoted here. I use these words, as they are very polemic, of course, but it's very interesting to stress it right now. Nevertheless, and quite remarkably, in the first quarter of the 14th century, it was this same performance, this same competition in the smallness, I may say, and this exasperation of this evolution that would bring the work out of the world of the common markets. Precisely because it would then become the tool of the aristocratic distinction and display the supereminence, I may say, or the most importance of the possessor, of the commissioner. This heroic mode of creation is particularly sensitive in certain particularly rare but quite remarkable works, such as the Hours of Jeanne d'Evreux, by Jean Pucelle, the illuminator Jean Pucelle, at the beginning of the 14th century, as you can see, now in the Cloisters Museum of New York. A manuscript, as you can see, of such great preciousness and painted with a remarkable care. When I present it to my students, I present him like this. You can see in detail all the detail of the miniatures and the care Jean Pucelle took to realize all these paintings. But it should be reminded that these quality made the students very often forget that these manuscripts is this size. And this manuscript measures 9 centimeters by 6 centimeters. And Charles Sterling, as I quote here, had already noted that this microscopic scale visually expressed the exceptional status of the owner, that is to say, in this case, Jeanne d'Evreux, the wife of the King of France.
How was this done, and what kind of heat?
Well,
how was it produced?
we do have some clues about that with special lenses they had at the time. Certainly, we do not have trace. We do not have any textual evidence of the way they really precisely do that. But it's done with special lenses they had and special tool made in silver. They could do very pointy tools in silver to do such incredible work. like this. But unfortunately, we do not have any textual evidence saying, okay, you do that and that and that, and then you get this kind of work. We just have to guess in some sort. And so Charles Sterling just noted that this microscopic scale visually expressed the status of the owner, of the commissioner. That is the same thing. We can think of what we face today about our laptops or telephone going smaller and smaller and smaller before now going bigger and bigger, but that's another thing. What Sterling calls a haughty privilege of the commissioner who can claim to have commissioned this kind of work. And very remarkably, we can see during the 15th century, several books that have a kind of size meaning the same thing. A sort of competition can be sorted out of in the 15th century illuminated production, such as the very small hours. It is the name, the Très Petites Heures, the very small hours of Anne de Bretagne, made around the end of the 15th century, whose folios are, well, I have noted there, 6.6 by 4.6 centimeters, but this is all the pages. If we consider only the textual part, the part of the text itself, it's 4 by 2.5 centimeters. And we will find an expression of this aristocratic privilege of the tiny, of the miniaturization, of this performance in the naturalization by considering that these dimensions are significantly the same that we find in another manuscript owned by Claude de France, which is the daughter of Anne de Bretagne, and significantly Claude de France paid a lot of money just in order to have a manuscript at the same size as her mother, in order to affirm and to display the idea she is the heir of Anne de Bretagne, and she could commission a thing such precious as this manuscript and this size manuscript. Sorry?
What is the date?
It's around 1512. I have it. I don't have it now. It's around 1512, 1520. Sorry, around 1520. Here, in this kind of image, the effect of multum in parvo, the effect of so much thing in a little space, is, I can say, as its weight, as its height, and it allows us to approach the idea I mentioned earlier, the idea which I want to recognize in this procedure of miniaturization, a mechanic, that is to say, a mechanic of the beautiful, a mechanic of the sublime, that is finally close to, in creating its effect, to that of Amiens I showed earlier, that is to say, the dilatatio and the amplificatio in front of the abbreviatio I mentioned earlier. The idea, this idea, finally joins quite directly the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard and its phenomenological intuition, which he stated, as I quoted here in the Poétique de l'Espace, that the minuscule contains all the attributes of magnitudes, and the first of these attributes is what in the work triggers the admiratio, yet another misleading Latin word, Latin term that is very present, that is very used in medieval rhetorical literature, especially in the 14th and the 15th century, and which designates the admiratio, designates this moment of pause, this moment of stupefaction, I may say, of the faithful, and the movement of retreat the faithful has behind a wonder, behind the admiration he has toward the admirable work. In this case, this is a case of these incredible Dutch prayer nuts of the late 15th century. We have now conserved both in Paris and Amsterdam. These woodwork are such prayer nuts were used for the faithful's devotion. They hold it and they can open it, as you see, and discover little scenes of the holy texts that is carved inside. Make no mistake, these nuts from there to there is no larger than, I may say, I don't have this one, but it's no larger than that, than 4 centimeters, something like that. And these we have other example of these wonders of miniaturization, and this concern for miniaturization goes so far that it can be sometimes totally useless. That is the case, that is a detail of one tiny prayer nut I've shown you. This is a wall of a scene. You have the scene, I don't know which scene it is, but whatever. And on this wall you have a ring in this wall, in this tiny wall, and as you can see, the ring is movable. And make no mistake, this ring is no larger than 1 millimeter, or 2 perhaps millimeters. This thing, when I say it's useless, nobody can see it really. There's no use of doing these ring movable in this scene, other than create the sensation of admiration, the sensation of admiration, which help the viewer to enter in his devotional process, I may say so. And the admirably large, as you can see, and the wonderfully small are therefore united in the same destiny. And this is nowhere more clear in the Middle Ages than in the work of micro-architecture. This is the case of the basement of the tomb of Philippe the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, in Champmol near Dijon at the end of the 14th century, where we can see the game on these homothetic relation with the built architecture here, with the built architecture, and the illusion, this illusionist confusion of these mourners, these people attending the funeral of the tomb of the Duke itself. They are showed like they are walking on a gallery, under a gallery. And then from them on, this dialectic between monumental and tiny, between small and grand construction, will be at the heart of these works of micro-architecture and will be invested with several and different meanings, which can concern, in particular, institutional issues. For instance, it can serve here to elaborate a sort of ecclesiological issue discourse about an institutional connection recalled by an architectural quotation. That is the case here between the Daroca, how do you call that? When you call the holy species, the Eucharist receptacle for the Eucharists here in Daroca, which site which quote most exactly the lower part of the choir of Zaragoza Cathedral. And this quotation is meant to recall the fact that Daroca Chapel was indeed in the dependence of the Cathedral of Zaragoza. And this institutional link, this institutional dependence is shown, is displayed by using in smaller scale the forms of the great monument itself. And in other cases, the microarchitectural form do not need to be explicitly linked to a particular built building. It derives its effectiveness, its agency, I may say so, from the process of miniaturization itself, a process that confers a particular value on the space that is circumscribes, if I can say, and which is, for instance, in the case of Sénanque, in the tabernacle of Sénanque, or at Chézal Benoît here, the space of the sacred supereminences is, because these are an Eucharistic reserve, which means that God Himself, through the Eucharisty, is present and dwells in these spaces. So the macro-architecture is there to underlineate and to manifest, to display the presence of the divinity itself. And miniature architecture plays an all the more effective role in signaling the sacred by displaying a network of rich or abundant forms whose complexity and confusingly is confusingly perceived by the viewer, like in Saint-Riquier, like this, while he's not being able to clearly understand what he sees. This is the case of these virtuoso devices of miniature stereotomy, for instance, and that require a very high level of technical know-how in order to carve this kind of baldachin. And this procedure of carving baldachin in building is a good example of the highly technical know-how that is closely linked to miniaturization procedures. And that's interesting that you asked me for how they did it for the manuscript we saw earlier. That's the same reflex that I want to mention. How did he do it? How is it made, and how is it even possible? That is the search. That is the aim of these carvers and these craftsmen. I can't deal in detail with that, but let me mention this. That these miniaturization procedure and the display of virtuosity belong to this category of the technologies of enchantment, as Alfred Gell has written. The work of miniature and the tiny became all the more effective in the Middle Ages because this effectiveness was based on what Gell called the halo of technical difficulty. The halo effect of technical difficulty, to be precise. This idea was developed precisely from the memory Gell kept of a child's visit when he was a child, of a child's visit in Salisbury Cathedral. The monument itself had left him indifferent, while he has been fascinated by a reduced scale, a miniature model of the cathedral itself that was on display in a lower chapel, and this tiny scale reducing model of the miniature was made in tiny matches. So you remember, have completely forgotten the entire cathedral and was fascinated by the tiny model of the cathedral in matches in the side chapel. And these virtuoso technical performance implied by the miniature work here as the well-known round seal mattress of Canterbury, therefore belongs to Gell's categories of enchantment, of which there are many examples during the Middle Ages, particularly after 1300, and which is inseparable from virtuoso in miniaturization, while it is still inseparable from the effect of the gigantic scale of building, as I've said earlier. But it seems to me that in the end, that these overview of some of the questions raised by the tiny in medieval art is above all these observations a lack in recent studies to fully understand the link between these two extremities of the scale. What unites the monumental sublime and the outstanding miniature? In the end, both are only the two complementary and mirroring expressions of the same heroic gesture, the same heroic register of artisanal creation in Middle Ages. The little one is then the bearer of what can be called medieval munificence. It's kind of the opposite of magnificence in small scale. And actually, I conclude by this, saying that one has to keep in mind all this history, all this long-term history, in order to understand clearly the cultural depth and effect of the research of contemporary sculptures, such as the South African sculptor and artist John T. Hurstville and his nanosculpture, that is real sculpture, made in the whole of, how do you call that? In order, sorry? A needle, sorry. The whole of the needle, and the head of an insect. And these are real sculpture made by John T. Hurstville. And I think one should understand the effect of this sculpture only by going through the entire history on the longue durée of the history of scale in Western art. Thank you very much.
May I open the floor for questions?
Whatever.
Esther, what about you? Some comments about this. This is extremely immensely enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, it reminded me of not only devotion and religion and the sacred, but the fascination with human craftsmanship and the world, which is a microcosm of the world, reminds me of cabinets of curiosities, where you really have cherry stones and very similar kind of admiration of either what is rare and represents the world that you don't know, like Chinese porcelain could be, or an imaginative animal like the unicorn, but also human craftsmanship and like these miniature cherry stones, carved cherry stones. And I think it was the awe and wonder for learning, for knowledge. And that is very interesting in kind of opposition or together with, let's say, the sacred and the devotional. So to look at these two elements. And then, and I agree with you, I mean, this would be fascinating to have a really study longue durée through the centuries, because again and again we see this everywhere. We see it in Romanticism, we see it Aristotle, kind of the catharsis effect. We see it in Kant. We see it in the 19th century. We see it with miniature dollhouses, with industrialization as well. And before, with dollhouses in Dutch, the 17th century Netherlands, where actually married women
were given these extraordinary miniature doll houses in a way to prepare them for their life as a married woman. But now my question, the monumental. So all of this is in a sense part of the human experience that relates us to something beyond the kind of everyday and the commonplace. But if it goes too far, it can turn into something negative, megalomania, that we see,
Hubris.
In fascism, that we see with kind of what someone described as dictator style, you know, this fascination with the monumental that several dictators apparently seem to share. So when is the tipping point, and have you thought about that? Yeah.
Just to contextualize,
yes.
We've in India in the last year or so had 2 statues which have been each been proclaimed as the largest statues in the world.
Yes, I've heard about that.
One
Yes,
is
I've heard
Shivaji
about that.
And the other was Sardar Patel.
Yeah.
Right? So this is I was just giving context for that in the sense
How
that I think this is a very interesting question of that.
And my question actually also sort of links up to Esther's points, because as architects, very often the way we are looking at scale is entirely mathematical, and our encounter with scale happens first through drawing, even prior to it happening at the level of building. So my question really becomes, looking at the miniatures as you did show, how is scale determining the nature of intimacy? Right? Is it preventing intimacy? Is it occluding intimacy? Or is it encouraging intimacy?
Okay.
Because there is a bodily relationship, which is, I think, what Esther you was pointing out to, that we have a bodily experience of scale, which we don't usually talk about in architecture school.
And I would precisely depart from your remarks because it's linked to what you said, Esther. I think to understand that, what difference between the gigantic scale in medieval time and what can be called the gigantic scale or the great scale or the greatness of, let's say, fascist aesthetic, to make it short, is that let's consider, for instance, we have 2 examples. I can show that it will perhaps we'll lose some time, but let's consider 2 examples that, in my view, are very useful. We have Saint Peter in Rome, for instance, one of the greatest and the largest, one of the largest church in Christianity, redone, entirely redone at the early 16th century and during decades on the 16th century, which is, when you're there, it's absolutely huge. It's colossal, it's gigantesque, even most of it the cupola, and you're only a tiny thing, and you can understand what this gigantesque scale means entirely when you look to the, how do you call that, the baptistry, not the baptistry, when you took when you put your hand on the holy water to sign yourself when you enter the church. I don't know the word in English anyway. This is receptacle at the end of the church when faithful supposed to. And these in St. Peter's, the original bénitier, let's say that in French, are enormous, gigantic receptacle bowls, something like that. They are seashell actually, put too high that you can't reach them, and it means that the entire building, even the objects that you're supposed to use, are not for you, are not meant for you. You're too tiny, too little for that. Though, in the meantime, in Amiens, for instance, you have the same greatness, the same scale, gigantic scale of the building itself, though the bénitiers are, in this case, tiny bénitiers, which are available for the faithful. We can enter, we can use it. So, it means that the question is not if I want to resume the opposition between Saint-Pierre and Amiens, for instance, is that Saint-Pierre is made for giants, is made for giant people who are out to be, well, let's say 3 times over their actual size in order they can put their hand in the bénitier and they can enter, while Amiens is not made for giants, is made for actual people at their size, but it places them in front of the greatness of the divinity. It's not the same relationship between scale between those two. And this question is important because it introduces the question of the youth of these objects and the body of the, as you mentioned, the body of the faithful itself. And then the question is that in such well-known and well-recognized painting as this one, we know that in some point, these little books, this tiny little book, these are my hands, so you can have the idea of the scale. This little book is too tiny to be read easily. You can't read it. It's really difficult to read it easily. So the idea is that certainly both you have these tiny books that prove that you are a great aristocrat that can commission something so virtuoso like this, and on the other hand, the tiny, even if you can use it, the tiny is the receptacle of the inner soul, of your personal devotion, your inner devotion. And if I have sometimes, I won't be late, I can show you something, a very, very fascinating example of this issue in an image that I've shown to my student last week, so I think about it today precisely. Yes, I think this is in it. This is this. Yes, this is this one. Here we have a picture in the Book of Hours of Marie de Bourgogne, which is daughter of the Duke of Burgundy at the end of the 15th century. And we have this representation of Marie de Bourgogne itself going through her book, her tiny book that she could, but it, you know, is larger than the one we saw. And on the window of her cabinet, of her studiolo, we see the apparition of the Virgin Mary, and one again, Marie de Bourgogne, which is represented twice, praying. So, and what we see here is not what we really see, is what she thinks, what she had in mind when reading the text. When reading the text, she's imagining herself praying the Virgin Mary that we see here. And on the same book, we have another fascinating illumination in the same book of, this is the same person, this is Marie de Bourgogne. This is Marguerite d'Autriche, sorry, this is Marguerite d'Autriche, another person. And we have just a painting of the crucifixion, which is the story of Jesus Christ crucified. And to make it clear that it's not a real representation, that it's only what is in the mind of the viewer that is reading, exactly, we are showing in the front part of the image little objects, these books, which the commissioner is reading at the moment. And this tiny, how do you call it? Sorry? It's not clearly a rose. Oh yes, this is right. And here, you see here, this is a box, a prayer notes that I've shown you, and this rosary is the same as this one with the. And what does it mean? It means that what we see is what we have when you go to cinemas. You see sometimes in a film, the camera is at the place of the. You see what the actor is doing. Your how do you call that? A camera. Well, I forgot the term exactly. You see, and this is we are Marguerite de Bourgogne, and we had in our hand this one. We just read this, and then we have this vision of the crucifixion.
Thanks, Jean Marie. It's a comment, and somewhere in there is probably a question. Thank you. That was very interesting, and it's got me thinking about a lot of things. But here's the first thing that I want to begin with. What is coming across from your talk, and this is what it made me think of, is that in the medieval times, and one could make this argument later also, what we are seeing is that the scale is about divinity. It is about the divine. It is about admiratio, which you say, right? And which is about a devotional process, right? And I'm thinking some of this is also happening when the pilgrimages are taking place. So the reliquaries and miniatures and all of that are also getting made of these, right? Now, however, if we shift, let's say, 200 years into the 17th century, 18th century,
Okay.
what we see is that scale has become secular.
Yes.
In fact, so
Exactly.
that's a very interesting moment. The secularization of scale that happens, right? All right, and okay, so that's so I'm thinking that, all right, so today when we talk of scale, and I think this goes back to what you were raising, Zai, is the question of the scale as a secular thing, right? That in fact the scale is a secular instrument par excellence, because it's constantly focuses, whether it's in a map, whether it's in an architectural drawing, the scale is what locates you within the technico-scientific discourse, right? So what's very interesting is, so my first question, should we call this scale? Should we call this scale, given that scale now is interestingly a secular form, right? But are we taking away something from the idea of because to me this is far, and it's okay, we can critique the secular idea of scale using this, but I also then want to throw one more thing into it. So we had scale, which was divine, and it's very interesting, you know, architects and other designers would always say that these were models for architects to work with. That's what your argument is saying, is that these were actually not models. They were never models. They were objects in and of themselves to invoke admiratio, right? To invoke this kind of the divine, the presence of the divine, which is something you know, which is very interesting. But I'm thinking, let's bring in the digital realm now into all of this, right? And I'm thinking that today, when we work on, let's say, a digital platform like AutoCAD, for example, which doesn't really talk of the question on scale, because you're working everything on 1:1 and you can infinitely zoom yourself out. So the object becomes, again, potentially an infinitesimally small miniature, right? Which you could now potentially, with all its details, send to a 3D printer, and you would suddenly have this kind of a miniaturization again.
Yes.
Not the secular scale miniaturization, which was the hallmark all through the 17th to the early 20th century. So what we are seeing is a very interesting thing that's happening, right? I would make an argument that the digital is maybe bringing back the admiratio,
Yes, it can
right?
be, yes.
Whereas
What's that doing to cult value?
No. Once we will come to that. I'm just saying. So the digital is bringing back this.
Okay.
so it's no longer, it's kind of undercutting the idea of the scale model in a sense, right? Because you could potentially today, and you know, there's this new thing in China now where everybody's body mapping themselves using these 3D cameras, right? And China and Japan, they're doing that, so they've got a stereo.
That's a French thing actually.
Right.
Because the company that devices.
No, I know the company is French, but it's taken on a lot of this thing in Japan and China. That they put a 3D camera all around themselves, right?
Yes.
And then they map.
Okay.
And every detail of your body is now reproduced into this 4-inch figure of you.
Really?
Right? So, in a sense, that is not a model of you. It's this kind of a miniaturization of you. So I'm just thinking that it's interesting for us to think of this entire layout. So the first question is really, should we think of this as a history of scale, or should we think as a history of it as divine versus secularity, in a sense, right? And what it is doing to something that we think is scale.
Yeah.
Because one could argue that these guys were not really thinking of it through the lens of scale. They were just thinking of it through the lens of divine and angularity and being in the presence of gods and everything. And you know, the later images that you showed us kind of reinforce that, right? It's
the last one.
the other one, the other slide, right?
Okay.
Whereas scale becomes this very, very secular thing,
Yeah.
which, however, I will argue the digital is undermining now. Sorry, those are just thoughts that kind of.
Related thing on that I will actually add to that what Guillouët is calling secular scale is just a transition of power being derived explicitly from divinity to now power being projected as separate from divinity. Yet the idea of large scale survives, and a large part of the miniaturization also, as much as admiration, it also goes to saying that, look, this is your place in the universe. Compared to what divinity is, what secular power is, you are vanishingly small, however clearly you define yourself. I mean, if you look at Indian miniature art, some of it, except for paintings, doesn't go back all that far, but you go to palace museums.
Yes.
You have this huge, gigantic space which serves no function for the people admiring it. Okay. Then you also have rooms with collections of miniature art. Okay. Detailed war scenes carved on single grains of rice. Okay. Little miniature wooden things that slide into each other, no apparent function except for admiration. But all of that again serves to put the observer in a particular range of scale, that you belong here. You neither belong up there nor you belong down here.
No, that's like it. But I think the reason why I bring out the secular is this, that you see somewhere, and I think, you know, and this was true for engineers, for architects, for designers, scale became this thing in which you would understand that what you're doing at a small scale is what is going to get reproduced at a larger scale in reality. So scale became a question of model. Right? Whereas these are never models. Those are never models. And that to me is very, very interesting.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
They are never models. They are actually, they are a representation of reality, which is, in that sense, they're reality themselves, right? Which is what it is, the divinity is what it is evoking, right? It is not a model, what Clifford Guillouët interestingly called the difference between a model of reality versus a model for reality. So Guillouët makes this argument that there are two kinds of models that we human beings are dealing with. Fundamentally, the one he says is a model of reality. Right? And to these, he will say, are models of reality. Whereas the secularization of scale leads to a model for reality. Right? So that this model is just an approximation. We will build it in reality later. So there the entire argument of potentiality versus actuality comes into being. But this is about the divine, which lets you see a different layer of reality, which you ordinarily would not. I think that's a very interesting. So if this is the difference between the two, should we think of it through scale to begin with, is
No.
the question I am asking.
The notion,
Yeah.
yes, I do agree with you. We should deeply, and that's why
No, I know, that's
I hope someone will take this issue and take it to the longue durée. You have to think of it. You have to think of it on the longue durée.
Right.
To think from antiquity, even from Judaic time, from all across time, until today, until the digital time, as you said.
It's very interesting digitally what's happening.
And to see how this paradigm changes through the time. Yes.
Yes, I mean, to some extent I already argued that it's also in the secular realm, not only in the religious realm, by mentioning the Cabinet of Curiosity, but we can go back further and look at ancient Rome, and then we have, of course, what is the functionality of the building of the object and the scale. So we have large scale for public buildings, whereas public was so important, or we have arches for military victories and things like that, or the market, but whereas we had private houses were small in comparison, and public buildings or legislative buildings and so on were big in ancient Rome, or the Colosseum, to give another example. And then, of course, I think it is interesting, Girish, what you say about our role in this, in connection with this. It doesn't only mean that we are small in comparison with the larger world of God, but it could also mean mastery over others in the aristocratic sense, because the Cabinet of Curiosity was a microcosm of the world, and the aristocrat was regarded as the master over this world. So we have many examples of this. So the miniature could also be, you are the master of this. In the moment you have a doll's house, you are the master of this. So it's not only that you are kind of in awe of God, but you are actually you are leading the miniature world, so to say. That's what
yes, and the miniature also served as a tool for the mastery of the word, something like that. I think.
And we know this. I mean, also for certain the Kunstschrank, for instance, in the Cabinet of Curiosity, they had hidden buttons so that the aristocrat and the owner of the house could surprise his guests who would come to visit by showing that he had the mastery, because then something automatically would open and so on. All of this was there to serve the aristocrat.
And I think of the Forma Urbis in Rome, the Forma Urbis in Rome, the maquette, the model of the Rome under Trajan that was in display, and with the traces of all the building itself there that were marked here, and the fact that this Forma Urbis had, the owner of the Forma Urbis had some right about the urban landscape of Rome. So there's a direct link between the owning of this maquette, of this tiny model of Rome, and of the Forum in Rome at least, and the urban landscape itself. So there's also this link toward miniaturization between the real world and the miniature itself. So sure, you're absolutely right. There's something about the word itself, not only divinity, not only the things I've mentioned, but also with the place of the honor of these tiny things, and what these tiny things allows him to do, to think, to place himself upon, something like that. Anyway, if there's no more questions.
Other questions? Folks? The rest of you? The faculty seems to have taken over. Anybody? All questions are good questions, remember? I would like to know how they used to read about those miniatures, because that's a question of technology.
What do you want?
Those miniature texts, and how do the people used to read it, because mostly all of the things that are done are about convenience. So.
Yes, that's the point, and that was said. But back at the time, back at the 15th century, that's all the point. Most of them, I suppose that most of them were in red, really red. Sometimes, perhaps, they had it in their furs or in their pockets, and they could use it while traveling. As you know, the point is also these aristocrats were always traveling from castle to castle until the the middle of the 16th century. French monarchy was mostly traveling. So they had this, but I think that importantly, more than reading these tiny books, they were admiring the pictures.
It was more about
I think it's more a visual effect than the lecture itself. As you can see, the lecture is, well, it can be done, but it's quite difficult. And even today we have glasses, but sometimes they didn't have. And we don't find, if I'm right, we don't find many lenses of lecture in the possessions of the aristocrats in late Middle Ages. So they had to deal with their view going lower and lower with the time. I don't know how they did that. Yes?
About the small books, you said it was really hard to read.
To read, yes.
But still people carried them on themselves when they were traveling. So was it actually to read, or was it like was it symbolic, like I am religious?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Other people to show other people that they're religious.
That's the idea. My idea is that owning this kind of thing, just legitimate yourself, even though you can read it as something like that.
Because
yes.
you need to have a substantial amount of money to be able to commission.
Exactly. That's exactly.
A book like that, and because print wasn't invented yet.
Sorry.
Print wasn't invented yet.
I don't know.
Printing. So these books needed to be handmade.
Yes, of course. They are all handmade. It can be. We are far before the invention of printing.
Expensive.
Yes, they are very expensive, of course, and that's why Charles Sterling called them very difficult to execute. Reserved for virtuoso seems to become a haughty privilege, which means a privilege reserved for very few people,
so
VIP
It
people.
was almost like the small book was a symbol of power, just like a big house.
Yes, it could be said that way. And also that the small book, we keep the same dimension of the book between the grandmother, the mother, and the child. So in more than three generations, actually. It's complicated that it could be done that way. The use of the same scale, more or less the same scale, is also a way to display this heritage, this familial heritage. And through the familial heritage, there's the legitimacy, of course. So something like that.
It would take a lifetime to produce.
No, not so much, because Jean Pucelle, which is a well-known painter, has been working for 3 years on this book. We know that for sure. He has been working 3 years on this book, and he has done a lot of things with.
3 years is a lifetime for 18-year-olds.
Yes, it is.
I also actually find it very fascinating the way architecture is represented and carried on your own being through all of these miniaturizations.
Yes.
Right? It is actually, it really makes sense under the context of admiration, as you've been talking about. That whole idea of an experience of awe, of wonder, getting down to a really small scale, and it's on you at all points of time, right? So every time you're handling that book, you're perhaps not just experiencing an idea, you're experiencing that there's a spatiality to it too. Which I guess was also what I was trying to investigate when I asked you about intimacy. Right? And I think, in a certain sense, you did answer that whole idea of going into a cathedral and feeling that sense of awe and wonder, but then really reducing the scale so much that your own access to that book is very, very conditioned. Quite brilliant.
Thank you.
All right, so, any other further questions? Any questions?
So, Shaura, may I actually make a request of you?